Under Napoleon, the French army was undoubtedly formidable, and during its peak from 1805 to 1807, it humbled all of the main continental powers, forcing them to alter their regulations and adapt to a new way of warfare. However, the French rarely saw anywhere near the same success against the British armies. At Alexandria in 1801 and at Maeda in 1806, as well as throughout the entire Peninsular War, it seemed that the British infantry soldier always got the better of his French counterpart. Although there is a very good explanation for why this occurred, unfortunately, and in no small part thanks to Victorian propaganda, the truth has tended to get a little lost, and even many great historians appear to misunderstand the real reason as to why the British infantry proved so effective, and instead continue to propagate long-standing myths. Therefore, in the following video, I'm going to show just what it was that enabled the British infantry to consistently come out on top, provide examples, and offer my own opinion as to why the French were unable to find a solution. Firstly, however, we must address and dispel the myths that continue to surround the topic. The first myth, and perhaps the most widespread, is that the French infantry always attacked in column, and therefore, because the British were in line, they were able to beat back the French attacks time and time again, simply by bringing more muskets to bear. However, there are several things wrong with this explanation. The first is that the French attack method was never intended to be delivered in columns, and rarely did it ever take place in this fashion. It is quite clear that French columns of divisions or assault were methods of manoeuvre before the final attack rather than an actual assault formation, as has been so often asserted. The French drill books of 1788 and 1791 are clear that troops in columns were required to deploy into line before the clash of arms, and in almost every battle in Central Europe and Spain in fact proceeded to do so. A column was designed for manoeuvre, and the idea was to cover the ground quickly in column and then deploy into line for action, because all knew and understood that linear formation was optimal for delivering a volley, as it brought the most muskets to bear. Even Napoleon acknowledged as much on St. Helena, noting that it was the weapons that determined the optimal formation of the men using them. Spears and shields favoured the phalanx or column, whereas firearms required line. Infantry, Napoleon asserted, should be able to operate in both close order and skirmish formations, and training should enable individual soldiers to shift rapidly from one formation to another. Since firepower was critical in combat, Napoleon noted that linear order, with its emphasis on fire rather than on shock effect, should be the habitual combat mode, but he also asserted that columns were still useful for both assault and manoeuvre. An effective army, therefore, had to be prepared to employ both lines and columns according to specific tactical conditions. The second problem with this explanation is, if it was so simple as line beating column, then surely the other European powers would have defeated the French, as they all favoured linear formation. The Prussians in particular, only half a century earlier, had demonstrated their prowess in linear warfare under the leadership of Frederick the Great, and dominated to such a degree that almost all of the European drill manuals advocated for the Prussian method of firing. In accounts of the Battle of Jena in 1806, it is shown that the Prussians had lost none of their proficiency in linear combat, and yet they were soundly beaten by the flexibility of the French. Therefore, it could not have been the case that it was simply line versus column that decided the issue between the French and the British. Ah, I hear some of you cry, but the British deployed their line differently to the other nations, for they deployed not in 3 ranks, but in 2, therefore bringing more muskets to bear upon the enemy. However, this was not always the case, nor was it even likely a deliberate tactical decision on the part of the commanders in order to counter the French, as Nafziger explains. The British use of the 2-deep line may or may not have been the result of an enlightened general wishing to increase the utilisation of firepower of its soldiers. No reputable historical statements to that effect were found when this manuscript was prepared. However, another equally sound reason for this practice can be found in the British infantry drill regulations. The British regulations, like those of every other European nation, specifically directed that the infantry be organised in 3 ranks. All of these regulations also directed that if the company's strength fell below a specific strength, the 3rd rank was to be incorporated into the front rank to maintain its frontage. These 2 regulation requirements alone are sufficient to support why the British universally used a 2-deep rank formation. An analysis of the strength figures of the British battalions deployed in Spain and Flanders showed that these minimum frontage requirements would have obligated the terribly understrength British battalions to be in 2 deep ranks. The French regulations had a similar concept, and this is why, during the 1814 campaigns, due to understrength battalions, the French were forced to deploy in 2 rather than 3 lines as well. Title 3, École de Peloton of the Règlement de 1797, states that when the number of files shall be below 12, the peloton shall be formed in 2 ranks. This would mean if the battalion fell below a strength of 198 men, it would form in 2 ranks. Therefore, the 1814 campaign probably saw the French operating in 2 ranks. This, however, would have occurred because of the requirement for a minimum frontage of the peloton. In contrast, at Waterloo, the British troops were actually deployed and fought in line 4 ranks deep, and yet still saw success. During the attack of the Middle Guard at the end of the battle, Maitland's Guard regiment were lying down awaiting their approach. When the French were a mere 25 metres away, the Duke shouted, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." Over 1,400 infantrymen in a 4-deep line stood up, virtually shoulder to shoulder, spread over about 250 metres. They delivered a shattering volley. The reason for this formation is possibly because of the impact that Kellerman's cuirassier had at Quatre Bras 2 days earlier, routing several units. The British had rarely, if ever, faced heavy cavalry in the peninsula, and perhaps their impact concerned Wellington, prompting him to increase the number of ranks. Although it could be argued that fighting in 2 ranks as opposed to 3 may have made a minor difference during certain engagements, it certainly wasn't the main reason for British success. This myth is the one propagated by Bernard Cornwell's brilliant book and TV series, Sharp, and it is that the British infantry fired faster than the French, more precisely 3 rounds per minute compared to 2. I'm not certain on the origins of this myth, though I suspect that it may have originated from the British naval dominance and has unfortunately been transferred over as an explanation as to why the British infantry were also dominant. The naval side is sadly an area lacking in my knowledge of the period, and although I am slowly addressing the issue, it means that I cannot offer a definite answer, but I am under the impression that the British naval gunners, through extensive drill, were able to fire 3 rounds per minute compared to the French's 2. If I stumble across the answer in my research, I will remember to come back to this video and correct it, but if anyone does know, then please feel free to comment. Anyway, back to the topic. Despite how enjoyable the Sharp series may be, this is again another myth, and it is actually more likely that it was the French infantry who fired faster. During the Napoleonic Wars, it was the French infantry, and not the British infantry, which enjoyed the higher reputation for their efficacious use of firepower. According to Robert Jackson, at one point the Inspector General of British Army Hospitals, the French excelled not only in their ability to deliver ordered volleys, but in their performance in all aspects of the manual of arms. The explosions from the French firelock astonished by the close repetition. Jackson further explained, "The sharpshooters and even the regular battalions commence their fire at too great a distance, often fire at an elevation, and as they are said to fire on many occasions without ramming, they fire with great celerity, so as to give the idea that they calculate to make an impression on the enemy by noise, rather than by the actual destruction by bullets." Therefore, it would appear that it was the French who fired faster, but in Jackson's comment there are 2 interesting points that he raises. Firstly, that the French tended to open fire at too great a distance, and secondly that they often fired at too great an elevation, often resulting in their shots sailing harmlessly over their opponents. There is little evidence to suggest that the British infantry suffered from this propensity to fire high anywhere to the same degree as their French counterparts. Both French and British observers, in contrast, are found to consistently comment on the devastating effect of British volleys. This difference in the accuracy of musket fire between the 2 arch-rivals is attributable to the British infantry's heightened awareness of the importance of properly levelling their muskets and their increased ability to successfully implement these practices under fire. Firing at similar ranges, the French infantry was instructed to level higher than their British counterparts. According to Douan's levelling recommendations, for example, infantry firing at 100 yards were to level their musket at the enemy's knees, while at the same range the French authority had the men levelling at the waist. Although this advantage in accuracy seems to offer an answer as to why the British were more successful, it was not always the case, and the French's fire was not completely ineffective. I would also argue that the Charleville musket used by the French was superior in accuracy to the Brown Bess used by the British, though perhaps that is a debate for another video, but at Quatre Bras, for example, the French skirmisher fire was both accurate and effective, with many British accounts giving praise to it. It also seems highly unlikely that the French would have conquered Central Europe if their volleys all sailed harmlessly overhead. No, although the British may have had an accuracy advantage, they certainly didn't fire faster, and accuracy alone does not account for their dominance in infantry versus infantry engagements when compared to the other European nations. If we accept that none of the above myths are the reason for British success, then what exactly was? There are two minor contributing factors to point out first, and these are both aspects seen during Wellington's tenure in the Peninsular War. Together, they are the use of skirmishers and the deployment of troops on the reverse slope, both hallmarks of Wellington's defensive battles in the peninsula. Wellington countered the skirmishers which preceded the French attack by developing a skirmisher screen heavier than that of the French. Where the terrain was appropriate, the classic British defensive position was in line on a reverse slope behind the crest of a hill up which the French had to attack, and thus concealed. Both of these factors, as Wellington most likely understood, affected morale, a subject which I covered in much depth in my previous video, because it is, in my opinion, the deciding factor in warfare, with the aim being to break the enemy's morale whilst boosting or maintaining your own, both of which Wellington's tactics achieved. The idea of the French skirmishers sent out ahead of the advancing French columns was to disrupt the enemy, weakening and wavering their morale through nuisance small arms fire, particularly aiming at officers and NCOs. However, by sending out a cloud of their own skirmishers, often more numerous than the French, the British negated this disruption. Of course, it must be pointed out that the other nations also utilised skirmishers, often called Jaegers, who again disrupted the French skirmish attack, which is why this reason alone cannot explain the British success. Deploying his men on the reverse slope also had a similar effect. When one reads of Napoleonic battles, the main French assault is almost always preceded by an artillery bombardment, aimed, like the skirmisher cloud, to weaken and waver the enemy formations, allowing the infantry or cavalry attacking to break through. However, Wellington, by smartly choosing his ground and deploying his men upon the reverse slope, shielded them from the worst of this fire, maintaining their morale and ensuring that the French assault was met with an unwavered determination. To several historians, it is actually this reverse slope technique that they believe holds the key to success for the British over the French. Due to their inability to see the main British line, the French would be unsure of when to deploy, if deployment were intended, and thus were still in column when the British line advanced to the crest. Although this may have been the case initially, or on a few occasions, it is still not the answer because, firstly, it does not explain how the British saw the same success in their offensive battles, where the reverse slope tactic was not possible, nor does it give any credit to the French, particularly when their officers were promoted on merit. Certainly it is possible that perhaps initially these French officers may have misjudged the timing because of the British position, and therefore been caught out whilst deploying into line, but they were not stupid, and I find it impossible to imagine them repeating this mistake for 6 years of fighting Wellington in the peninsula. Surely they would have simply deployed either halfway up the slope or even at the bottom, rather than risking being caught out again and again. Although these two reasons certainly are responsible for a small portion of the British success, the real reason is best explained from the French perspective. French Colonel Bourgoid recalls a stereotypical attack upon a British position. The men became excited, called out to one another, and increased the speed of their march. The column became a little confused. The English remained quite silent with ordered arms, and from their steadiness appeared to be a long red wall. Very soon we got nearer, crying, "Vive l'Empereur! En avant! À la bayonet!" Shakos were raised on the muzzles of muskets, the march became a run, the ranks fell into confusion, the agitation became a tumult, shots were fired as we advanced. The English line remained silent, still and unmoved, with ordered arms, even when we were no more than 300 yards distant, and it appeared the storm was about to break. The contrast was striking. In our innermost thoughts we all felt that the enemy was taking a long time in firing, and this fire, held for so long, would be very unpleasant when it came. Our ardour cooled. The moral power of a steadiness which nothing can shake overcame our minds. At this moment of painful expectation, the English walls shouldered arms. An indescribable feeling would fix many of your men to the spot. They began an uncertain fire. The enemy's steady, concentrated volleys swept our ranks. Decimated, we turned round, seeking to recover our equilibrium. Then, 3 formidable cheers broke the silence of our opponents. At the third, they were on us, pushing our disorganized flight. Private Wheeler, when describing his regiment's exploits in repelling a French counterattack at the Battle of Nivelle, offers in simple terms the British perspective. We allowed them to come within a very short distance of us, and then we poured a volley into their faces, and before they had got well over their surprise, we were upon them with our bayonets. A short-range volley, followed by a bayonet charge. This was the main tactic used by the British infantry during the period, and it is to what they owed their success. Simple, but why was it so effective? It was the combination of both parts of this tactics that were vital to its success, but let us first discuss the impact of the short-range volley. Since the battlefield domination of Frederick the Great's Prussian infantry half a century previous, with their almost mechanical reliability in operating their arms, quick-firing volleys became the method which the other European nations had sought to copy. As discussed earlier, by the time of the Napoleonic Wars it would be the French who were in fact regarded as the quickest, but even the British regulations written by Dundas copied and opted for elements of the quick-fire Prussian method. The problem with this method is that when firing a musket, the first volley is usually the most accurate because the smoke generated makes visibility and therefore accuracy of subsequent volleys diminished. However, the musket is also a notoriously inaccurate weapon at ranges above about 80 yards. Therefore, most nations, commencing fire at ranges beyond this, were almost wasting their first and potentially most effective volley. This is something that the British commentators did note, with one soldier labelling the French and Spanish notorious wasters of ammunition. Nosworthy breaks down how infantry engagements in Central Europe would usually take place. The attacking body would often stop and begin firing, despite the most determined efforts of their officers to renew the assault. If this happened, especially when the two forces were still at only a medium range, a prolonged but relatively ineffective firefight usually occurred. Though causing a lot of noise, smoke, and general confusion, these types of affairs were usually not decisive, and lasted until one side ran out of ammunition or decided to settle the affair with cold steel. Because of the flexibility granted to the French by their tactical system, which most of Europe would eventually emulate, they were often able to win out these stalemates with well-timed reinforcements, but the British, as shown above, utilised a different method. They very often refused to engage in such drawn-out and ineffectual affairs, instead preferring to hold their fire until the enemy was close, often at about 30 paces, and at such ranges even a musket couldn't miss. To further the effect, the British would also often employ a full battalion volley, where every musket in the battalion would fire simultaneously. The effect of this at such short ranges was, unsurprisingly, devastating. The other, and yet vitally important effect of withholding fire until the last second was a psychological one, and Colonel Burgoyne in his vivid description of a French attack touched upon it. In our innermost thoughts, we all felt that the enemy was taking a long time in firing, and this fire, held for so long, would be very unpleasant when it came. Our ardour cooled. The moral power of a steadiness which nothing can shake overcame our minds. As Burgoyne alludes to, most soldiers understood the effectiveness of their weaponry, and therefore knew the power of a close-range volley. And if the defenders did indeed hold their fire, then the attackers would become weary of what was to come. As time passed and the defenders remained motionless, the attackers' ardour would begin to cool, and the first seeds of hesitation would start to manifest itself in the ranks of the oncoming force. When this was combined with the British soldiers standing motionless and in silence, the sight and thought must have been terrifying. The psychological dimension is also very significant. Contrasting with the animation and noise that accompanied a French advance, the complete silence and immobility of the British line was profoundly unnerving to the attackers. It is to this morale factor that the second part of the tactic, the bayonet charge, becomes even more relevant. As discussed in more detail in my video on morale, clashes of the bayonet between two opposing infantry forces in open terrain were an extremely rare occurrence, with one side usually running before any actual contact was made. The reasons for this were purely psychological, for if a unit began to waver and its weakest members started to run, it would inevitably create a cascading effect to the point where even the bravest man realizes that he cannot face the enemy alone, and so he joins his colleagues in the fleeing. Encounters therefore became essentially a game of morale chicken when resorting to the bayonet. The charge of the bayonet was a tactic seemingly almost wholly psychological in nature. Charges were normally only launched against an enemy already wavering from the effects of musketry and who would generally flee before bayonets were crossed. Therefore, a bayonet charge on its own would often not work because the morale of the enemy was not yet broken. However, the British volley, because of its short range, usually caused heavy casualties, reducing further the already decaying morale of the attackers. Then, the British would break their silence with 3 cheers or huzzas before charging out of the smoke with fixed bayonets. Having seen their enemy show no inclination to break from their own longer-ranged fire, nor from their determined advance, it is little wonder that the French, upon receiving such a crushing volley, then gave way to the British shock action with the bayonet. When this tactic was combined with Wellington's preponderance in placing his troops behind the crest of a hill, thus further protecting their morale, the results were even more proficient. The British would fire at close range and cut down the head of the French column, causing even more disorder if the French attempted to deploy under fire. Then, seeing them shaken, the British would cheer and charge with the bayonet, tumbling the French back down the slope. The British would then halt and retire to their original position to await any renewed assault. Chambray described another action at Sorauren, in which the British were concealed on a reverse slope, but with officers on the crest observing the French advance. Suddenly the British appeared, fired, charged with the bayonet, and overthrew them, but did not pursue. On the contrary, after having remained some time near the crest, they retired in double quick time and resumed their position. The French were astonished at having been repulsed almost without having fought, so rallied and reascended the hill, but as before received a discharge of musketry and were again charged and overthrown. It wasn't just on the defensive that the British used this technique, however, for in many of the battles in the peninsula, especially after 1812, they were the attackers, and yet the volley and charge tactic continued to serve them well. During an attack by Leith's 5th Division at Salamanca, the French, concealed on a reverse slope in squares but for their skirmishers, who had been driven back by the British light troops, fired as soon as the British appeared over the crest, and immediately Leith ordered his line to fire and charge, which swept away the French in moments. Seen again during the storming of the heights of Vedra at the Battle of Bidossa in 1813. However, the 95th moved regularly up the hill to within 30 yards of the top without firing, and then, by way of breathing, gave a volley, loaded and advanced to the top, the support close behind them. These events were repeated whenever the British and French infantry faced off, from Alexandria through to Waterloo. In the example given earlier of Maitland's Guard regiment repulsing the chasseurs of the Middle Guard, their almost point-blank volley was followed up by the usual huzzas and charge, and, as expected, upon passing through the smoke they found even the mighty troops of the Imperial Guard breaking and fleeing before them. In a great example, Andrew Field breaks down the repulse of the main French attack during the Battle of Talavera in 1809, and all the trademarks of the volley and charge tactic were present. The French skirmishers pushed back the British light troops with ease and crossed the Botina Brook without interference from the silent red line beyond. Sherbrooke's division covered more or less the same frontage as the two French divisions that were advancing against it. The British general had given strict orders that the first volley should not be fired until the French columns were only 50 yards away, and that this single volley was to be immediately followed by a bayonet charge, the essence of British tactics in the peninsula. As the French columns advanced to within extreme range, they would have expected the first volley, as less experienced troops were prone to fire early. When this fire did not come, and the British line remained still and steady, the advance would have become more agitated, as the indicators of a breakdown in British morale appeared to become less certain. Once the French came into range, the inevitable occurred. The front ranks of the two French divisions were cut down in the single tremendous discharge, and before the bewildered survivors could collect themselves, the British charge broke through the smoke. Despite the best efforts of the French officers and NCOs to organise a measure of resistance, the columns broke up and their soldiers turned away in the face of British cold steel. I suppose the obvious question now is, why did the British utilise this method, and where did it originate from? And to answer that question, I have to give immense thanks to David Blackmore, whose PhD thesis I stumbled upon, and which I have linked in the description below. Titled Destructive and Formidable, British Infantry Firepower 1642 to 1765, it is honestly a great read and traces the origins of this technique brilliantly, highlighting the changing firing methods that the British infantry deployed, as well as their adaptation to fighting different types of forces, while still maintaining the doctrine of close-range fire and use of the bayonet. The technique is first found in British use during the English Civil Wars, and it seemed to come about as a deliberate alternative to the already accepted methods of musketry, which were immediately dismissed by both sides as ineffective after the first major battle at Edge Hill in 1642, as Blackmore explains. At the start of the period under consideration, the first armies to engage in the English Civil Wars did so in a completely textbook manner, employing long-established methods of delivering musket fire. At Edge Hill in 1642, it was found that the level of fire generated, although sustainable, was insufficient to force a conclusion in a firefight between infantry regiments. There was subsequently a very rapid nationwide change, which appears to have started within weeks of Edge Hill, to delivering the infantry's fire in very short, sharp bursts at very close range, followed by an immediate assault. This was found to be a very effective technique against both cavalry and infantry, and became used almost to the exclusion of other, earlier ways of delivering fire. This method of holding fire was not entirely original, as the Swedish under Gustavus Adolphus had used a similar method, known as the salve, but it was only a part of their firing practices, and it was used with nowhere near the frequency nor the exclusivity of the British. It is likely that this development owed something to the techniques introduced by Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden in the 1630s, but British infantry developed those techniques and took them to a new level. This development occurred in isolation and was not matched by anything similar in Europe, where the use of this method of fighting by troops from Britain achieved dramatic results. As Blackmore points out, the technique was developed in the isolation of a civil war, but once the British, over the next century and a half, began to utilise it with great effectiveness and to much praise on both European and American battlefields, why did the technique not catch on? As stated, the Swedish fire methods had advocated for close-range volleys under certain circumstances, therefore continental Europe was well aware of their effectiveness, and it is no surprise to still see it in use by the armies of the Napoleonic period. An example of this actually occurs at the Battle of Talavera against the British. A column of infantry was coming towards my battalion. I let them approach as much as they wanted. My soldiers were ready. I had absolutely forbidden any firing before I would give the order, and instructed that it would be battalion volley firing. When this column was about 60 paces away, I saw its chief become agitated. He did not know how to get out of the bad position he had engaged in. At the moment when he ordered his men to turn back, I ordered, "Battalion, fire!" No shot was wasted. The whole front of the 83rd Infantry went down. The 83rd Foot lost 283 men that day. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon, surely the chief seen by Vigo Roussillon, was amongst the 42 killed. The British were also on the receiving end of close-range volley fire during the Battle of Cowpens in the War of Independence, where the American mixed force of militia and regulars unleashed a devastating volley from under 30 paces that broke the British and won the day. Despite these examples, in nowhere besides the British Army did the technique become a mainstay and constant guiding principle. I have not yet come across the exact reasoning for this, but I will offer my own thoughts on the matter. In terms of the Americas, much of the combat often took place in broken terrain, particularly woods and forests, and the British Army had to very quickly adapt its soldiers to light infantry and skirmish tactics in order to properly combat the militia and native forces that they encountered. Although the British light troops often still did stick to the doctrine of closing the distance before commencing fire, it does not seem to be the volley and charge as we are familiar with in the Spanish Peninsula. Many of the American militia were also often armed with early rifles, enabling them to outrange their British counterparts, meaning that keeping engagements at longer ranges suited their weaponry. However, as shown at Cowpens, they certainly also understood the effectiveness of close-range volleys, but it never became their go-to combat doctrine. As for the reasons why the European nations never took to the technique on a regular basis, I think there were many factors at play, preventing it from taking a proper hold, despite the British's proven success with it. Firstly, the debate that raged throughout European military circles during the 18th century concerned whether or not it was fire or shock action that was optimal for combat. Fire usually meaning standing in lines and delivering volleys, and shock being the use of the bayonet and attack columns in order to drive the enemy back, often at the expense of stopping to fire. Despite the British showing that a combination of the two was effective, in the end it was Frederick the Great's Prussian infantry, with their quick-fire method and mechanical efficiency, that became the model for infantry doctrines moving forward. Although that would explain why the method wasn't adopted prior to the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, why would the French, upon being repeatedly shown by the British the effectiveness of the volley and charge technique, not adapt it themselves and utilise it against other nations? I cannot help but note that there is perhaps a sense of cultural differences playing a small role here. It is not to say that the British were superior in any sense, but that when one examines the different nations, it is difficult not to notice subtle differences in their battlefield natures. For example, Napoleon was appalled by the lack of prisoners taken during the capture of the Shevardino redoubt prior to the Battle of Borodino in 1812, with the Russian soldiers seemingly prepared to die rather than surrender, a stubborn nature that also saw their gunners preferring to fire until overran, inflicting as many casualties as possible rather than saving the guns. In comparison, the French soldier is notorious not only for his elan, suiting him to offensive actions, but also for his individuality, which, although brought a small sense of insubordination and complaining within the ranks, no doubt was a reason for their excellent skirmish and light infantry work during this period. The British soldier, on the other hand, is known for a certain stoic and stubborn nature. Although these traits have unfortunately been over-exaggerated through Victorian propaganda, it is difficult not to argue that they certainly were to some degree present, and it does offer a reason as to why the volley and charge technique suited the British soldier. Standing in silence with shouldered arms, waiting for the enemy to close the distance, whilst also receiving the effects of their longer range fire, could not have been a comfortable experience, and certainly required a certain nature. I'm not suggesting here that because of this stoicism that only the British would have been able to do such a thing, clearly not, as almost all the other nations utilised close volleys at certain points, as well as made much use of the bayonet, but the volley and charge becoming a core tactical doctrine does seem, dare I say it, rather British. Although this subtle difference in the nature of the soldiers most likely did have a small impact, I don't believe that it was the main one, and I actually think there is another factor at play in the encounters between the British and French during this period: cavalry. Cavalry played little roles in the battles of Alexandria and Maeda, and they were not as prevalent in the peninsula as they were in Central Europe, simply because maintaining horses in Spain and Portugal was much more difficult due to a lack of sustenance. It is for this reason that cavalry forces, although always present, were kept to a minimum, with Wellington even writing to his superiors in Britain requesting that they don't send any more horses, as he could barely maintain the ones that he had. The French, renowned for their cavalry exploits during this era, kept theirs to a minimum for similar reasons, and one doesn't see any of the heavy cavalry regiments that the French were famous for making an appearance in any of the major battles in the peninsula. The British sources from Waterloo, having never encountered cuirassiers before, mistakenly refer to them in letters and memoirs as guard cavalry, which of course they were not. This limitation of cavalry is important because the very nature of the volley and charge technique makes it extremely vulnerable to a quick countercharge by cavalry. After delivering a full battalion volley, the troops then break ranks to charge, and it is in this disordered state with unloaded muskets that they would stand little to no chance if caught by enemy cavalry. Therefore, in the peninsula, the British were able to successfully utilise this volley and charge technique without having to ever really fear reprisal by enemy cavalry. However, in Central Europe, where cavalry numbers from all sides were much higher, committing to this technique would have been much more dangerous. There are still examples of its use from all the different nations, but with nowhere near the frequency or consistency of the British in the peninsula. At Waterloo, the British again utilised the same technique, this time repelling the middle guard. However, their success is nearly short-lived, as the minor disorder from their charge is magnified by canister fire from a French artillery battery. According to Ensign Macready of the 30th, when his regiment became entangled with that of the 73rd, 33rd and 69th, the brigade became heavily disordered, and 50 cuirassiers would have annihilated our brigade. Thankfully for Macready, Marshal Ney had wasted the French cavalry several hours earlier, meaning that he and his colleagues were able to retreat and reform safely behind the crest. A counter-argument could be that if the British knew they were threatened by cavalry, then they simply wouldn't charge, and although they would still close the distance before firing, instead of a full battalion volley, they would opt for a different fire method so as to always reserve some of their fire. However, at Waterloo, when the 52nd Foot under Colonel Colborne opted to, instead of charging, simply traded volleys with the 4th Chasseurs, as Colborne admitted, the 52nd suffered severely from the fire of the enemy. Although the 52nd were triumphant over the 4th Chasseurs, who broke with the rest of the middle guard, it is clear by consulting the casualty figures for all the units involved in this engagement that the 52nd, by opting to trade volleys rather than charging, suffered the heaviest. Many past historians have misinterpreted the French accounts, in which they make reference to the impact of the British volley as being proof of British fire superiority, and therefore believing that this alone must have been the reason for their success. However, upon reading British accounts and considering the evidence, it is clear that they rarely engaged in long-winded firefights, and instead usually relied upon a devastating close-range volley followed by a bayonet charge. It was the combination of these two factors that helped ensure victory. The historian David Chandler, although initially believing in the superiority of British fire action, in his essays on the Napoleonic Wars he corrects himself and offers a good summary for us. It was the combination of British volley fire with, above all, the feared blood-curdling English cheer and the dire psychological threat of the bayonet attack that divided the vast majority of Anglo-French infantry confrontations at the battalion and brigade level. Thus, the shock element of the British formation was the essential ingredient of victory rather than the supposed effect of their fire action alone. Hopefully this video will have cleared up a few myths and offered a more believable explanation for British success over the French. Until next time, thanks for watching.